First of all, my thanks to both speakers for masterly expositions of their respective subjects. I am not going to try and create any artificial connections or parallels between them. They are studying extremely different sorts of situations in societies that would not really work. So we've got something like a half hour for discussion. I believe we've got a roving microphone. I'll follow the procedure that we adopted at yesterday's plenary, to take 3 or 4 questions at a time and then ask the speakers to respond, and just to see how many rounds we can get through. And I would like to reiterate the point that was also made yesterday: good questions be questions. Thank you. Who would like to set the ball rolling? Yeah, there's a gentleman in the middle here. Perhaps if you could also just briefly indicate who you are before the question.
My name is James Poole, historian of Africa, also work at currently at Monmouth College in the US. And I was interested to ask Dr. Lonsdale about what we might think of as the sort of legacy of legacies, right? That there's, and you know, as historians are starting to go back to the post-colonial period and see it as part of the period that we look at, we're starting to, you know, where we used to get all these studies of, you know, what's the legacy of colonial rule, we're now beginning to reflect on what the legacy of post-colonial administrations are. And so, you know, you laid out a number of these, you know, sort of models of revolution and what they've meant for the countries that come after. And I was thinking particularly in terms of some of the claims that have been made on behalf of Tanzania at this point, both by, you know, Mahmoud Abdani, who's argued that Nyerere Ujamaa and villagization programs helped to create a national identity that eliminated the need for ethnic violence. I don't find this terribly convincing, but it's an interesting question. And then on the other hand, someone like Jane Monson's work, in which she argues that, you know, part of the legacy of Ujamaa and of the Tanzanian-Zambia Railway was that it gave local peasants a language with which to make claims upon the state. And so, you know, when I think about the legacy of Nkrumah in Ghana, I think, you know, there are some ways in which Nkrumah's vision of national development has allowed, you know, while it had limited fruits in his own period, have allowed Ghanaians to conceive of development in the contemporary period.
Thank you.
Yes, John Hutchison, this is a question for Dr. Waldron. To what extent did the experience of the Second World War, or rather the Japanese invasion, give strength to this ideology of national humiliation of the Chinese Communist Party, and give some support to its attempts to transform Chinese society's revolution. In other words, it give a certain legitimation that the revolution itself was not could not be succeed until Taiwan was recovered, until Hong Kong was recovered. So there's a kind of mutual relationship between this cult of humiliation.
I'll take one question here, and then I'll take 4 questions in total, so I can see another hand.
Yeah, Chris Hughes, LSE. I know more about China and very little about Africa, but my question is actually to both of you. Arthur, you actually talked about two countries during your presentation, China and Japan. And if we bring in Africa as well, it seems to me Japan is really a very interesting place because it too modernised and had its own kind of revolution, if we count the Meiji revolution as a sort of revolution. And the difference, it seems, is that Japan had a very strong army, and it was the army that did a lot of nation building, whereas China never seemed to be able to get a strong army in place to do that. And so I think it's actually, the question could be applied to Africa as well. Is this perhaps another ingredient that you need to look at, that the army as a political actor that actually builds the nation?
And I'll just take the fourth one there, and then I'll come back to others who've indicated in the second round.
Thanks, Christian Kumar. This is also a question for Arthur Waldron. You're sceptical about the role of nationalism in the struggle against Japan, and I think you're sceptical both about its role as an agency of the struggle, but also its nationalism as an outcome of the struggle against Japan. In both cases, nationalism doesn't seem to you to be a particularly helpful way of thinking about what was going on. But I wonder whether part of the problem is deciding what constitutes, what kind of language we should be using to describe that struggle as nationalist or not. And I was thinking as you were talking about the parallel with, say, Great Britain and Britain's opposition to Hitler, their stand against Hitler, the whole thing that goes under the Dunkirk spirit. I don't think people talk about British nationalism very much in relation to that struggle against Hitler, and I wonder why that is. And you wouldn't deny, and there's some kind of spirit of resistance, uniting people, mobilizing the people, which helps to overcome all the dangers and difficulties of fighting Hitler. Isn't there something comparable in China that we might, I don't know whether the Dunkirk spirit would be quite the right thing to say about the Chinese case, but isn't there a way of talking about what mobilized the Chinese to resist the Japanese? It was a formidable power. They were very fragmented, as you show, and yet they struggled and they fought. And what is it how do we describe that struggle? You think nationalism is not the right word. You don't think communists contributed very much either as communists. So I just wonder whether part of the difficulty of reading here is to do with the vocabulary, the language of patriotism, nationalism, resistance, whatever. I just wonder whether there are different ways of describing this.
Okay, perhaps we can respond to those questions first. Let's go in the order I think maybe the original talks are. This one first.
Well, let's have three questions to keep in mind, which is a challenge in this hour. The first had to do with the whole issue of national humiliation and how it contributed to what followed. And I don't think that the war with Japan was seen, it was felt as a national humiliation. I think there's no question about that, because the fact is that the Chinese fought valiantly, and casualties of 3 million military dead, 18 million civilian dead, 95 million homeless. I mean, this was huge. But the war ended with the Soviet invasion of Manchuria and the U.S. atomic bombing of Japan. So the myth arose that there had been a victory. I think if the United States and the Soviet Union had not entered the war, some Chinese political figure, not Chiang Kai-shek, would have in some way come to terms with the Japanese. But the chief thing I'd like to say in response to your question is that for the first really 40 years of the People's Republic, the whole experience of World War II was not discussed. Most cities have a war memorial. In Peking there is the Monument of the People's Heroes, and there's one panel which is of a guerrilla and guerrilla operations. But there was no World War II memorial until the anniversary, I guess 20-some years ago, when they built a memorial park and built a museum. And there's a whole science of how people feel about memorial parks. Was the day that I and my wife went there. No, there was nobody else there. It just opened, and the admissions charge was 10 yuan. And most national memorials do not have admissions charges. But the point I'm trying to make is that right now in China, and for the last 20 years, there's been a very delicate process of trying to get the history of World War II straight. And most Chinese now would agree that the communists did not win the war. But in the early 50s, the story was that Jiang didn't fight at all and that the communists won. This is obviously quite a volatile thing to say, but I expect that this will continue. One of the reasons, I think, for the anti-Japanese demonstrations is the feeling, well, now we Chinese are strong. Finally, let's get a punch back. I remember once sharing a seat in a bus coming back from dinner where we met one of the famous foreign residents of Beijing, and I sat next to a drunken cotter, and he said, my job is to convince the people here that Japan is our friend, because Japan is a friendly country. And he said, I can't get anywhere, but they just say, we remember what the Japanese did to our villages, we remember the atrocities they carried out, we've got nuclear weapons now, why don't we just nuke them? And he couldn't, no matter how cleverly he spoke to them, he just couldn't get the local people to respond. So I think the whole legacy of World War II is sort of in flux in China today, but I don't think it's officially part of the national humiliation narrative. The question of the military, until the Japanese invaded, China was developing a modern military with German assistance, and then during the war with American assistance. But they had no navy, unfortunately, which meant they couldn't prevent landings on the coast, which were decisive repeatedly. Today, of course, in the People's Republic, the army is very strong, and the degree to which the military is a kind of a national symbol and asset, and also helps to keep orders is hard to overstate, I think, and it's often neglected. And there was always the idea that militarization is a war on this war and that. I had a Chinese friend who said that she wanted to work on the medical front. As in Russian, the language of war comes into the language of peace. Christian asked about, how do you characterize this war? I seem to be saying that there's no nationalism. This is hard to answer, but I think that there was no sort of implicit sense in the struggle that a new nation was going to emerge, as you often find in nationalist struggles. But make no mistake, the Chinese fought absolutely bitterly, and this is one of the reasons that the losing side, the Kuomintang, feel that they're the real losers in World War II, because they took all the casualties, and then in the end they got chased to Taiwan. There were occasional moments when you could glimpse a kind of popular nationalism, and this is the last point that I'll make. I wrote an article some years ago about General Zhang Zedong. There's Zhang Zedong, Zhang Zhizhong, and Zhang Zhijiang. But Zhang Zedong was not aligned with Chiang Kai-shek, but he was a professional military sort, and he had his own division. And he was the highest ranking casualty on our side in World War II. And he was killed in hand-to-hand fighting in Hubei in 1940. And his entire unit was killed, and the number of bayonet wounds, bullet wounds, etc. that were found in his body afterward is just extraordinary. And his major had suffered lung injuries and wasn't really dead when the Chinese got back after the Japanese had left. The Japanese had been kicking the bodies around and a very nice pen rolled out of the general's pocket. He was dressed as an ordinary soldier, and they suddenly realized that they just killed one of China's top generals. The major told the story of this last stand, and the funeral of this man, which I used to give a lecture about, and I got lots of photographs, was an entirely spontaneous event. It was not orchestrated in any way. One day he was dead, and all of a sudden, all over China, there were great patriotic outpourings and memorial services and all the rest. And Chiang Kai-shek, who was no friend of his, kept his picture on his desk for the rest of the war. So I think that there is an incredible tenacity and ferocity and self-sacrificing quality like the Chinese resistance that has to be, it can only be admired. I mean, there's unit after unit dies to the last man. But in the study, whether this was in reaction to the enemy, I made the point at the very beginning, that this is called the anti-Japanese war. Whereas in Russia, the war against Napoleon was called the Fatherland War, and the war against Hitler was called the Great Fatherland War. And I think there's a little bit of a difference there. The Chinese were reacting to being invaded, and that pulled them together. And just the last thing, when you talked about the demolition of France and all, I passed over that very quickly. But the idea that a war like this is necessarily going to bring political unity or a new agreed-upon nation-state is perhaps doubtful. Of course, what followed this war was a bitter civil war. Anyway, I've gone on too long. Thank you.
Right, I've got two questions to try to answer. First from Dartmouth, the other Dartmouth. Yes, I do think that historians should take increasingly seriously the fact that a generation or two has passed since colonial rule departed. The period of African independence is now just about as long as the period of colonial rule. And one would therefore expect precedents to be called upon from post-colonial times when people are making claims, political claims today. So that seems to me is entirely predictable. As far as both Tanzania and Ghana are concerned, I know a little bit more about Tanzania than I do about Ghana, but not very much about either. There's been a recent book about Tanzania called, I think, In Search of a Nation, in which Jamie Monson had a chapter, and it was quite extraordinary, I thought, how little mention there was of the language of the nation in this book. It was mostly about local claims. They may well have been claims against the state, but claims, I think, based on very much on local issues. How much of a generalizer and a nationalizer the experience of enforced villagization was, I think it's possibly a little bit doubtful, but clearly a lot of resentment was caused, but it seems to me it's pushed people back onto their local roots. I think Ghana is probably a very much better case in that so much of the anti-colonial energy was directed as much against Ghanaian chiefs as against the British, in fact possibly even more against the chiefs, largely over land issues in the way in which the chiefs had exploited traditional so-called land rights for private capitalist purposes. And there's this same kind of resentment amongst ordinary cocoa farmers as I understand it today. So very much the same kind of grievances I think exist, and very much the same kind of claims as Nkrumah tried to mobilize with the CPP, I think can nowadays still be repeated. But I think that in general one would expect this kind of claim making to relate as much to post-colonial developments as to colonial. On the question of the army, it is clearly in the interest of armies to build nations. And certainly there was a time, because how otherwise are they going to be funded, and from where are they going to recruit? And the officer corps is clearly a self-interested generator of that kind of loyalty. And Africa underwent a series, well, between 40 and 60 coups. The numbers vary according to one's criterion of coup in the 10 to 15 years or so after independence. I think that true to my presentation that Africa is all sorts of different places, one could perhaps have a sort of a scale of nationalist achievement, at the top of which one would put Colonel Nasser of Egypt, who had by far the largest army, the only one who'd actually fought a war in 1950. Was it 52 or 54, humiliated by the 1948 experience in Palestine, with a very strong cadre of disaffected officers, the free officers behind him, and who had a very clear idea of how you should clear out the corruption behind them that had led them to the defeat in Palestine, and you get rid of Farouk and co. As well, of course, as the British. So a very clear professional sense of what was needed in Egypt in order to create the kind of army that would not then be humiliated again. I think I would put him at the top of one's sort of creative military coup leaders. The Ghanaians, I think I would come second, for totally different reasons, that they had very good Sandhurst training and they knew that they should not be in power, although they got rid of a very unpopular dictator, and they left very quickly, handing over to people just like them, in other words, the chiefs, the people who would send them to Sandhurst. So that was a very British coup there, but they did preserve, I think, the unity of Ghana and a degree of constitutional decorum as well. The Nigerian army is sort of betwixt and between, in that it has an extraordinarily ethnic sandwich of, or did rather at independence, with largely northern Muslim private soldiers, largely Yoruba Western sergeants and sergeant majors, and largely Igbo Christian jumped up lieutenants who had just done their 6 months training at Sandhurst and thought they ruled the roost. Whereas, of course, the Northerners who had helped to drive the Japanese out of Burma as private soldiers, and the Yoruba sergeants had different ideas. So you have an army which, in a sense, reflects all the regional inequalities of a nation and helps to tear it apart in the Biafran War. But perhaps the most destructive army, of course, is the Zimbabwean one. Which, as a guerrilla army, now enjoying power, having practiced terror in order to gain power, can't seem to get rid of that habit. But perhaps the most important thing to say about African armies is they're all very small, very expensive things, armies. And most African states manage to afford an army by hiring them out to the United Nations. And a great many African armies are not at home. If you travel around Kenya today, you'd be amazed at how many Sarajevo hotels there are. The ex-soldiers invested their lumpers in hotels. They had served in Bosnia for the UN and came back and founded Sarajevo hotels.
Wow. We've got time for maybe just a couple of questions, but I'm aware that people might want to be refreshed before going to the dinner. So there's a couple of hands here, and let's take those three, that cluster of three.
Eric Compton, Burton College. For John Lonsdale, whose paper I really enjoyed both papers, by the way, but this is just a question for John. It's a question concerning ethnic diversity in Africa. You're probably aware that this literature that ascribing some of Africa's development woes to the fact it's the most diverse ethnic part of the planet, and particularly sub-Saharan Africa. And just trying to understand how that came to be, how much of this is the colonial legacy of drawing lines and naming certain groups through direct rule, and how much of it is pre-colonial, because it is also true that within Africa you've got relatively high ethnic diversity in sub-Saharan Africa, but not in North Africa. And also within sub-Saharan Africa you do have some homogeneous states, such as, I'm thinking Somalia. Somalia is one. But just how you would explain this range of diversity? Why is sub-Saharan Africa very diverse?
Right, I'm Jeremy from the War Studies at King's College London. I wish to ask a question about China, especially the history of the Xi'an mutiny, which led to the formation of the United Front in China during the Second World War. So during the Long March, we actually had some members of the Communist Party there who genuinely believed in world revolution, and these people managed to put up a military expedition, which is a ill-fated one, to Russia, to the Soviet Union. And during the year before the Xi'an mutiny, Mao faced an existential threat, and he faced the real threat to his existence, and had to develop a strategy of divide and rule in order to survive, to counter the threat of the Manchurian warlord. So my question is here. Obviously, he adopted a nationalist appeal to turn the gun of Manchuria against the Japanese, and all that you in history during the war and afterwards. But was nationalist appeal the only form of appeal he could adopt? I mean, that sort of appeal did not seem to work with Muslim warlords. And could he adopt a better form of appeal that could actually please everybody, please Muslims, please jungle out the Orthodox matters, and without creating division within the party? So, thank you.
Thank you. Just one last question here. No, sorry, and then I'm afraid I'll have to draw
Goldsmiths College. Both speakers, the context of since the conference is about nationalism and revolution, and you're addressing this, what about the context of, Soviet internationalism and American internationalism, their interaction? I think the last people were sort of getting at that in terms of China, but also in terms of Africa, the Cold War in Africa, the American internationalism and Russian/Cuban internationalism, and their interaction with the fostering of various nationalisms, and the problem. The thing that you did mention, I think, about China, the relationship not between Japan and the Chinese Communist Party, but the Chinese Communist Party and the Russians.
Thank you. Okay, I think I'm sorry I have to draw the line there. We've got to 6:15. So if I can just ask Arthur first to respond, and then John.
Well, the first question is rather complex, because you're asking me in a way to say how Mao should have dealt with a particular historical set of circumstances which were incredibly difficult, because China was divided into military. There were militarists who were willing to fight the Japanese, but were also jostling for power. And Mao I think he was reluctant to take a straight nationalist, we must unite to fight the enemy approach. I mean, the communists did form a united front. Zhou Enlai at Chongqing was very, very enthusiastic about the war effort, but always lying behind it was Mao really believed in communist internationalism. He believed that after the communists came to power in China, there was going to be no border with the Soviet Union. He did not see what he was creating as being a nation state. It was a people's republic, and he of course went to see Stalin, and he really, as far as we can see, he identified very closely with Stalin. There are many pictures from the early years of Mao and Stalin's faces together. It's the upper left-hand corner of a poster kind of beaming down on the scene. But the problem with Stalin was that he died relatively young for a dictator. He was 74 when he died, whereas Mao was 82 and Chiang Kai-shek was 86. So no sooner had Mao identified with Stalin than the great man was dead. And Mao felt that he should become the leader, not of the Chinese movement, but of the world communist movement. So there is, I mean, there's no question in my mind that Mao was very much a convinced internationalist, and he believed, I didn't read it, but in his protracted war, he talks about the need to have revolutions in Japan and all the other countries. The only way you're ever really to get this war over is to have revolutions everywhere. My own view is that Mao made some mistakes once he came to power, but I think it's a great mistake to suggest. Jonathan Spence has a little book about Mao. He says Mao was a not very intelligent man who achieved great power. As the first line, I don't agree with that at all. I think Mao was extraordinarily intelligent and resourceful. But he didn't know the world, and he was a true believer in world revolution, and he was willing to sacrifice, for instance, Chinese claims to Mongolia to that end. Now, the other question I'm not sure I completely understood.
Well, I think you sort of answered it. So
But what was it?
about this interaction between, you were looking at the effect of the Japanese on whether or not this creates a kind of nationalism within, mainly by the Chinese communists. And I said that the other side of the story, which is now looking towards the Soviet Union.
Yes.
You've answered the question.
Yeah, no, I think that I remember very well as an undergraduate sitting in the famous rice paddies course at Harvard, and John Pierre Fairbank, the great dean of Chinese studies, saying, well, you have to understand about the Chinese communists is that they're not really communists, they're nationalists. And I thought to myself, that really resolves the problem. We don't have to worry about the Chinese communists, they're nationalists. And then a few years later, I said to myself, wait a second, what's a nationalist? And I've sort of been stuck there ever since, which is why I'm up here on this platform.
Right, perhaps we'll learn where John got stuck.
I was asked an impossibly difficult question about ethnicity and economic stagnation. I co-edited a book last year, which I can actually tell John, which was refuting this argument, which is the economist's argument that with ethnic diversity you can't have the concept of the public good, and therefore there is no possibility for investment in growth, etc. I think the argument has to actually go the other way around. Ethnicity is by and large, politicised ethnicity at least, is a consequence of the kind of stagnation that has occurred, because ethnicity has changed so much in its character, I think, over time. You asked about pre-colonial, colonial times. I mean, Africa was a very underpopulated continent full of very small groups of people with comparatively little concentrations of power that would in any way act like turning peasants into Frenchmen with conscription and mass education and so on. That kind of power simply didn't exist in pre-colonial Africa. It was a colonizing continent full of enterprising groups of people who developed their own cultures, their own ecological cultures, depending on what kind of ecological niche they were exploiting, and their cultures sort of celebrated the means whereby they won their control, limited control over nature. I think that ethnicity became a totally different kind of phenomenon in colonial times, largely, I think, because of Islamic brotherhoods and vernacular Bibles and the kind of heroic kind of myths that were generated by that kind of reading and thought. And it's only since, I think, colonial times that really hard-edged political ethnicity has taken root for reasons to do with the inequalities of post-colonial development. I'm sorry, that's a horribly simplified answer to a very interesting question. But as far as Soviet and US internationalism is concerned, which I was asked about, I mean, clearly one can't understand the last century of African history without them. And I've been astonished actually at how much the British actually called in American aid in late colonial times in terms of educating African officials. Thomas Boyle's famous international airlift with the aid of Jack Kennedy. Soviet internationalism, of course, scared everybody in 1960 in the Congo, when Congo split into three with a UN, a Belgian and a Russian protectorate. And of course the South Africans were scared stiff by Russia-Cuban internationalism in the 1970s. You probably all heard of Soweto Rising in 1976. The most, I think, instructive photo I have seen of the Soweto Rising is a young man holding out a placard saying, "It happened in Angola, why not here?" And that, I think, was enormously important in persuading the apartheid regime to say, hang on, we've got to rethink how we're going to survive here. So, yes, one would have to, I think, say quite a lot about about the Cold War and its influence on decolonization, as I very briefly skated over.
Okay, well, before I, on your behalf, thank the speakers, I just a little announcement if people had forgotten. There was a conference dinner at the Strand Palace Hotel, which is along the Strand from Trafalgar Square on the right, and that's at 7 o'clock, and look forward to seeing all of you who are going to that. I've been persuaded for a long time that nationalism is an impossible subject, and when I listen to historians, I know it's an impossible subject because of the variety of things that get discussed, either about its presence or, in some cases, its controversial absence. But I'm convinced that the only way we're ever going to get hold of this impossible subject is by having historians who both know a heck of a lot about a particular subject, but also then use ideas in conjunction with all that complex evidence to actually produce some coherent arguments, and that's what we've heard today. And I therefore very much like to thank our two speakers for doing that for us. Thank you very much.